the last three verses, really 14 and 15, but the last three verses of this chapter. So we started into this last week with the discussion of how Enoch and Elijah and Moses, at this time at least, were considered to be those who had escaped Sheol and gone to live with God in heaven. And then as I demonstrated with Luke 23, how Jesus told the thief there with him that they were going to paradise that day, not heaven. So that was the way they were thinking in that time. So that's how we started this verse that way, because that's the beginning of this verse. But what comes after this is what we're going to be dealing with today in verse 15. For we do not have a high priest, Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So, as I promised weeks ago, we're going to get into this question. Could Jesus have sinned during his temptation or at any point during his life here on earth? And I've told you that the theological answer to this question is no. Now, when I say that, I gave you plenty of reasons, plenty of things to think about when we first brought this up as to why this theological answer is not necessarily a satisfying answer. It's satisfying in the respects that it bolsters your faith in Jesus as God. It doesn't bolster your notion of him feeling everything you felt. Because if you say that Jesus could not have sinned, you have to question, well, then how can he sympathize with my weaknesses? Because one of my biggest weaknesses is giving in to temptation. So how does that work? If he couldn't have sinned, how could he have felt what I feel all the time? So there's this question theologically about that. Even after I give you this explanation, at least for me, it still doesn't make the problem go away. Because there is just a difference between being human and being God. So that's still going to hang in the air even after this explanation. But at least you'll have the theological explanation. And I'll also tell you up front that the reason this is a problem is not really the question itself. Could Jesus have sinned? It's because Jesus, being in the position of God, causes the problem. Because if Jesus could have sinned, you've got God being able to sin. So that's why we have to explain this away. We have to get rid of this problem and answer this question theologically. Along with this verse, we've already covered this in the second chapter, where he said that he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people and be able to sympathize with our weaknesses. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. He can sympathize with our weaknesses. These two verses work the same way. They're talking about the same thing. So we'll answer this question as we go forward here. We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. We have to understand what these two words mean to be able to answer this question. So that's step one. We are told here and in 2 Corinthians by Paul, Jesus knew no sin, and in 1 John, in him, Jesus, is no sin. So it's very explicit that Jesus did not sin. And the question that we're asking is it possible for him to sin? So the answer to the question of did he sin is documented. The question that was left in the air was could he have sinned? And that's the one we're addressing. But this becomes important after we answer the question. So, what is sin? And what is temptation? What is sin? Go back to the Old Testament, bring it to the New Testament. The Old Testament word, Chata, is literally to miss the mark. And the easiest way to think about this with both of these words, the Greek word that we're going to see and the Hebrew word in the Old Testament, is shooting an arrow at a target. And you can either hit the bullseye or miss the bullseye. And that's what this word means. You have a target, but you didn't make it. You missed it. So when you think of sin, that's what the word is describing. You had a target, but you didn't hit it. And so it becomes figuratively a moral, sinful failure. Now, best explanation for this, the best example of this in the Old Testament for me is the first time the word happens in Genesis. Genesis 4, 5 through 7. For Cain and his offering, God had no regard. So Cain was very angry and his face fell. So he wasn't able to hide that fact. Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? And why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. That's this word, Chata. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Let's go through this a little bit. Start at the bottom. Sin's desire is for you. We have it built within us, a sinful desire. And that's going to be the question mark here. But you must rule over it. Now, this word must, I put it in italics. Why would I put it in italics? Because really it doesn't say you must rule over it. It just says, but you rule over it. But they couldn't leave it that way, because if they left it that way, it implies something that it really doesn't say. It's in an imperfect tense, which that's why they added this word, because it sounds like if you leave it out, but you rule over it, as if we are in full control and we will rule over it. But that's not what it means, because being in the imperfect tense, it is basically saying this idea. You can rule over it. You have the opportunity to rule over it. But it leaves the question mark. That's that idea, and that's why we're discussing this in the first place. Now, the issue of why are you angry and why is your face fallen? God says, if you do well, will you not be accepted? So what you have to realize here is at this point, what has Cain done? They were bringing sacrifice to God, him and Abel, his brother. Abel brought the sacrifice, the sacrifice of the animal, and Cain brought the sacrifice of the stuff that he had that was the best, which was his crops. And God accepted Abel's sacrifice above Cain's sacrifice. So what has Cain done wrong? He hasn't done anything wrong yet. At this point, Cain has not sinned. God chose Abel's sacrifice over his sacrifice. But that didn't mean that what Cain did was sinful. It just means that God chose one thing over the other. Why would God choose Abel's sacrifice over Cain's sacrifice? It was a blood sacrifice. And if you don't give a blood sacrifice, it's not any good. Well, that's wrong. Because if you go and look at the law, there are sacrifices of things that aren't blood sacrifices. So that's not got anything to do with it. They determined to give a sacrifice, and they brought the best of what they had. And God chose Abel's sacrifice. You see this happen over and over again. God chooses something and doesn't choose something else, And there's not a reason for it in the sense that we would consider a reason. God just simply chose. I mean, why did he pick Israel? Because they were the best nation? He just picked Israel. That's up to him. It's not up to us. So that was the same issue here. But the problem that comes up is Cain realizes that he's in second place. And he reacts the way we react as humans when that happens. He didn't like it so much, he killed his brother. And then, what was killing his brother? That's where God drew the line and said, this is a sin. But at this point in the story, there has been no sin. You can't really say, well, God knew that Cain was the bad one and Abel was the good one. How did Cain and Abel get there in the first place? God made them. God made Abel. God made Cain. So it wasn't anything in Abel and Cain at this point. This was the plan all along. God demonstrated how it was going to work. Here we see a demonstration of a lack of faith because Cain was not willing to assume the position that God put him in. That's something to notice. Also, this notion of if you do well. So we take that to mean if you do righteously versus doing unrighteously, which implies that Cain's offering was unrighteous. But that's not what this word well here means. If you go back to the chapters before this where God's creating, every day when he finishes, he looks at it and what does he say? It's good. That's a completely different word. This word yatab is a word of degree. It talks about beauty and expertise, and so you can have things that are less well and more well, but it's not a binary word like good and evil. It's a degree. So what he tells Cain here is if you do well, you will be accepted, and that word means to pick something up, to elevate it. So if you do well, if you grow in beauty, you will be elevated. He's not saying you've already broken the rules. You've committed a sin. Because of our bias, the way we think about things with good and evil, we throw that in here, but that's not what it says. So at this point, Cain was okay. Because notice he doesn't say you have sinned. He says if you don't do well, sin is crouching at the door. So sin is over here just waiting for its opportunity. Doesn't say he's already got you. He's telling Cain, sin is crouching at the door. And what does Cain do? Ἁμαρτάνω, that's the verb. Hamartia is the noun. Sin itself would be hamartia. To sin is ἁμαρτάνω. So it's the same idea. It's a little bit different because it means directly to be without a share. But if you think about the target, it's the same idea. If you don't share in the bullseye, you're outside of it. So it's the same idea. And so its secondary definition is to miss the mark. So you have a target and you missed it. Sin is the violation of the order God created. God had a way he wanted man to be, or he had a way he declared for man to be. And when you get outside of that order, then you have committed a sin. It was outside of the order God had set for man for Cain to kill his brother. At any point, this is what you really have to think of. Sin is not a real thing like gravity. Gravity is a law, a cosmic law that wherever you go in the universe, it's the same thing. And it has existed since God created the universe. So so you can say sin is something that didn't start until God created the universe. That's true, but it's not something that works outside of God. We often take these things like sin and we take it outside of God as if sin is something that exists that God doesn't like. But sin doesn't exist that way. Sin is something that God created. Just like he created everything else. God created sin. So sin is not above and outside of God. God created sin, which means he's still in full control of sin. And that's why the definition of sin has to be subordinate to God. God simply defines what he wants sin to be. You follow that? It's not something that just is. God has to decide what sin is and assign sin. He has to make it sin. So if God defines what sin is, then what does that mean? It means that God can't sin because God defines what sin is. Right. If God does it, it's not sin because by definition, sin is what God doesn't want. If you can think about sin as not being this universal thing outside of God that is this universal existence, but something that God has himself created and defined, it makes it easier to understand everything that happens after that. So that's the key. Here's a New Testament example of it. James 4:13 and 15. You who say, today we will go, instead you ought to say, if the Lord wills. And then in 16 and 17, this is the explanation. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So this is one of the black and white words. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now before I emphasize that, let me explain that for him it is sin doesn't mean the kind of thing we hear today where everybody has their own truth. Your truth and my truth may not be the same. That's not what this says. For him it is sin simply means, in that case, he sins. So there is a choice there. Whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it has a choice, and if he chooses not to do it, it is a sin. Now notice, this is not the law. What does the law do? The law says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not commit adultery. It defines, all right, this is a sin. This is not like that. Those things are sins, but what this says is, you know what's right. How do you know what's right? Well, God created you to understand you have a sin nature that he also created. And he built us to know what's the right thing to do. And when we know what's the right thing to do and choose to do something outside of the order that God established, we have committed sin. When Jesus is God, he's in the part that decides what sin is. And it is his order, and therefore he can't be outside of that order because he defines what that order is. So he can't sin. Sin is the violation of the order God created. So if Jesus is God, or can be described as God, because that's how we eventually get to the Trinity, he can't violate his own will. Because anything he does means he wanted to do it, and that means because he's God, it's within the order he established. So he can't sin. So we've established that he can't sin. The other issue is the one we have to address next. If he's going to be able to sympathize with our weaknesses and he can't sin, then how can we say he was tempted? Well, then how can he sympathize with our weakness where we're tempted all the time? When we say we're tempted, what does that mean? What is temptation? And I'm going to have to stop here. But for us, temptation is the desire to do evil. That's why we have a problem.